hear from time to time. I'm not just being defensive because Wendy is my wife, but it helps me get a different perspective on things. And so oftentimes I hear, I wish that appraisers could just get these things figured out. I wish that they understood value, right? I wish that they would just get up to speed, you know. Anyway, lots of different things. Now, keep in mind, the Code of Ethics talks about that. It talks about how we talk about those in the realtor family, and we can be we can put ourselves at a little bit of jeopardy, I guess, if we're not careful with the things we say. So I think a lot of the things that we say are based on a lack of a little bit of education on how this process works, what they do, what the responsibility is, and who they represent. Anyway, so that was the first question. All right, secondly, can one of you talk, and it doesn't matter who unless you want me to pick, talk about the importance of appraiser independence? Wendy.
A little bit about that. So in a transaction, the appraiser is an independent contractor. And if there is a transaction, the appraiser is really the only one who doesn't walk away with a piece of the action. I mean, you have the lender who gets the mortgage, you have the realtor who gets the commission, you have the buyer who gets the house, the seller gets the money, and the appraiser is unbiased. They have no piece of that action. They don't have a.
Can I ask you just to project your voice? Our microphones are right here in the ceiling and you may be far away from them. It's okay.
Anyway, we don't have any interest in that. We are independent. We don't have, you know, the feelings and the emotions and we're not part of that frenzy. And that's why I think the lenders, that's why we are hired by the lenders. We have an unbiased, uninvolved idea of what the value of that house is. And that's why we have to remain independent. We can talk with lenders, we can talk with realtors, we can discuss, you know, facts about the house, facts about comparables, but we just can't be swayed or, you know, pushed towards a value. We can't be intimidated, we can't be bullied. There's just reasons that we have to be separate from all of that because we're giving a value of something that we don't have a, you know, a feeling or a emotional attachment to like everybody else in the transaction. And so that's why we are hired, because we don't have an emotional attachment to this transaction. Does that make sense?
Awesome, thank you. Anyone else want to add to that? Okay, okay, perfect. All right, so the next question is, so why is an appraisal important? I mean, pertaining to the lender, why do they order appraisals? So, you know, because anyway, that's a question I get. I don't understand why we have to have appraisals anyway. If someone's willing to buy, someone's willing to pay this amount, why, what's the purpose of this? I don't know who wants to grab that one. Ryan?
Well, basically, the reason why, and I'm probably not, there probably should be a lender that's actually answered this question, but from what I understand, is the reason why they're having the appraisal done is one, they want to analyze their risk involved in the transaction, and then two, they need to determine the loan to value ratio in order to actually structure the loan for the borrower. And also there, you know, there's other things that are involved. There's other things that are involved with that. Underwriting guidelines and so forth, what they want the loan to conform to or what it won't conform to. So we need to know those kind of things.
Right. From what I understand about loans, they like collateral. The lenders like collateral, right? So the collateral value has to equal the money they're giving.
Correct. Yes, they need, that's why they're how they're figuring the loan to value ratio. They need to know that the collateral they're taking in is sufficient for the loan that they're going to give out. Yeah, so they want to determine the value of it, and part of that is understanding the definition of the value that they're looking for. There's different types of values. There's market value, there's loss value, then you have insurable values. There's different definitions for each one of those terms, and they're looking for market value. And market value doesn't, the definition of market value doesn't say that they want to know the highest value of that property or the lowest value of that property. That's not what market value says. Market value is what's the most probable value. In other words, 9 times out of 10, how much will that home sell for? And so that's part of what we're doing is we're trying to answer that question for them is market value.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
No, that was a great answer. And that's, as you could expect, the importance of, so if all homes come into value, there would be no need for appraisals, right?
I guess not.
I think the other piece of that is the property itself. Is it a home? Just because I might want to pay you $100,000 for this home, there might not be anybody in the world that's going to want to pay that money because it maybe doesn't have a kitchen or maybe doesn't have, it's in poor repair. So that's the other thing is we're looking at is that home going to be marketable if the customers were to have to get foreclosed on?
Yes, thank you. That's Tracy from First Fed, by the way. She answered that. And you're right. So a one-off situation doesn't establish value.
Yeah, that's what I was talking about when there's other things we're doing there than just looking for the value. We're actually assessing the property itself and the condition of it and the condition of that collateral that they're going to take in because they want to know those kind of things also is like what kind of condition is the home in? It's not necessarily what the loan. If the condition isn't what.
Hold on, we're gonna pause. One moment, sorry. Hang on. We're trying to get the sound a little better here.
That's awesome, isn't it, guys?
Yeah.
Probably worse for now.
So the microphone is going to be used over there now because I can't get the two tied in together. But okay, give this a shot, and you're going to have your announce now or really project.
Okay. Sorry, Ryan, finish. Sorry.
Okay. So that was part of what I was talking about is that there's kind of layers, I guess you could say, when we're doing the appraisal. We're not only determining the value of the property, but we're also answering some other questions that the lender has, like the condition of the home and other factors that play into their decision to make that loan or not. So that's what we're doing.
So Ryan, how much of that is a subjective opinion versus true fact? A house that sits 300 feet off of Falls Avenue, for example, is that a busy road? Yeah, asking for a friend. One man's opinion is that's a busy road. Another man's opinion would be, well, you're 2 miles out of the busy, or you're far enough back, or you're in an area of pristine homes.
I guess what's your there's facts and then there's your professional judgment of those facts.
Okay.
Which that I guess you would say is my opinion.
Yeah.
So yes, there is that part, which comes from the experience you have at doing appraisals and
Sure.
and and knowing the area that you're working in and so forth.
Right. No, we're just in such a unique market that some of those location issues, I think, they almost become void in the market we're in.
That's exactly right. And that's the other thing that we do as an appraiser is we analyze the market itself. And that's exactly what happens is when supply and demand get out of balance, there's certain factors that in a normal market would make a big difference. However, in other conditions of markets, it would mean nothing. And a good example of that is a busy road.
Yeah.
When there's very little supply and there's an extremely high demand, those kind of factors kind of go out the window. It's no longer valid. But that also has to be supported by the data that you have. And so you'd have to have additional information there other than your opinion that would back your opinion.
Okay. So that kind of leads into the next question a little bit, because when you talk about the facts involved in an appraisal, you represent the client. And this is an interesting thing that not a lot of people understand. Maybe all of you do here, but I think it's helpful for the broad general public of agents to understand, who is the client? First of all, who pays for the appraisal? We all know that, right? The buyer. Who's the client?
Person who orders the appraisal, typically the bank.
Right, so the bank's typically the client, but the appraisal oftentimes is ordered by another entity, right?
Yes, it can be.
Yeah, oftentimes AMCs, right, is what they're called. What does that acronym stand for?
Appraisal management company.
Right, okay. So the appraisal management companies will order the appraisal oftentimes, sometimes the lender orders the appraisal. But the buyer pays for it, but it's a federal regulation, if I understand correctly, that the client is the lender.
That is correct. Whoever engages us is our client.
Okay. Anyhow, so that's kind of a misnomer out there. A lot of people don't quite understand that, and
So Nathan, basically, after the meltdown in 2007, the banks, they stopped letting the banks order appraisals directly to the appraiser, so they came out with these AMC companies to be the kind of the buffer. First Federal kind of has their own department that runs it, so they don't use an outside source like that, but most of them do. And it is basically so the appraisers can't get together with the loan officers and the realtors or whatever.
yes.
Yeah,
Blur that line.
it's supposed to be kind of a protection thing.
Well, right. And unfortunately, I do remember in those days, and I remember lenders saying, well, we order from so-and-so because we never have to worry about value, right? That's a problem.
Yeah, I think it's good to understand that, the appraisal fee is just part of the cost of you borrowing the money. When you're borrowing the money, you're kind of at the mercy of the person you're borrowing the money from. And so that's just part of that cost.
Correct. So it's a closing cost, just like a tax service fee is a closing cost. And that's a separate entity, right, that collects that, but the bank has to pay someone to monitor the taxes over the life of the loan. And so, yeah, there's lots of little
And
fees.
origination fees and credit application fees. There's just all kinds of title fees. So it's just part of that process.
Okay, awesome. All right, my next question, and this is one of the most, I think this is one of the most important things, and it's a little bit difficult. This is one of the parts where I feel like we really need to focus on educating ourselves and all the agents that we represent, and for brokers, those that work under us. And that's understanding what a comparable sale is or a comparable listing. Can we get one of you to answer that?
Well, in a perfect world, it would be an identical home in the same subdivision that sold in the last month. That'd be your perfect comparable. Obviously, Twin Falls doesn't have a lot of that, so you find the most similar as possible. Similar location if it's not in the subdivision.
Right.
I know, as of late, with our market, it's hard to find truly comparable sales in a lot of areas. And so when reaching out to realtors, can you help me? I'm having a hard time finding something that supports where you listed your home for. Help me. I've received a lot of feedback from realtors that say, well, the property down the street sold for so much a square foot. How come you can't apply that to the subject? Well, we as appraisers don't value comparables that way. We don't choose comparables based on price per square foot. That's not how we come up with our comparables. We choose our comparables, like Jaysen said, they have to be similar in size, quality, location, and price per square foot is not something that we choose to find in comparison. That's not how we choose our comparables. And I did a property the other day that was a 3,000 square foot brand new construction home. I reached out to the realtor, can you help me? And she gave me quite a few 1,000 square foot homes, but based it on the fact that it was price per square foot. So
these are selling for price per square foot. So my subject should be so much more because of these. And we had a conversation and we talked about, well, let's put it this way. If you were going out to show clients that wanted a 3,000 square foot home, would you be showing them 1,000 square foot home? They're not comparable. They're different. And so we can't use 1,000 square foot home for a 3,000 square foot home. We have to find properties that are similar. And we don't do that price per square foot. We just don't value things that way. I mean, at the end, we can see where the price per square foot is, but that's not how we pull comps. Does that make sense?
So that leads me to, I mean, we don't have to get off that yet, but it leads me to another comment. Oh boy, I'm losing my train of thought here. Let's see. I lost it. I'll think of it here in a minute. I apologize.
I do have a question.
But please, Derek.
So obviously you have a criteria that you guys use. So you start with the components of the square footage, the size of lot, the age of the home. I mean, is there like a basic criteria you start with and then start weeding it out? I mean,
Well,
like,
that's kind of the
I'm going to
last
repeat his question for those because the speaker's up here now. So Terry's asking, is there a basic criteria that you start with for pulling comparables?
Well, it's kind of the law of substitution. I mean, when you go to show a property and your client wants 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, you know, the school district, you know, they want, you know, something that's a little older or a fixer upper. That's kind of the same criteria that we use. We go through the market and find, you know, what could this house be substituted for in the market?
So I had this, you know, recently as far as value was concerned. It was actually the other agent said, hey, I need to understand where'd you come up with this price? And truthfully, there was no justification for it. We were 100% expecting someone to pay cash and it worked out. I mean, you know, because I know that if there was a loan, and so that was the education part that I gave, and that was what I was thinking about earlier, by the way. This was the education part that I gave my client was, look, if the only financing that if the only offer we get includes financing, which has to appraise, and they don't have a large down payment, we can do that math, right? If it doesn't appraise for value, they're not going to be required to buy it, and unless we eliminate the appraisal contingency. But if we eliminate that contingency, they have to have the money to pay for it, right? So this is the education factor, right? Many times people will get multiple offers on a listing and accept the highest one, which is an FHA loan. And what does FHA make everybody sign at closing or before closing?
Form that they can.
FHA Mandatory Clause or a VA Mandatory Clause, which says that if it doesn't appraise for value, they don't have to buy the home. So even if they waive the clause, do you see what I mean? They can't waive FHA or VA requirements. Does that make sense? So, you know, when we're accepting these loans, even though that they say that's waived, we have to know and understand that financing factors in to the appraisal. It also factors in as far as requirements when they go out. So once again, I mean, that's probably a question I have down the road, and I'm probably jumping ahead. But what are some of the differences between financing? I'm sorry, what are some of the differences in loans that you get, like FHA, VA versus conventional?
I think the best way to answer that is just kind of illustrating it, because basically an appraisal is not that complicated when you're just applying the appraisal standards that we go by. And so the appraisal standards, this is a most recent copy. This basically is our, I guess, so to say, Bible. So we have to always comply to these guidelines when we do an appraisal, whether it's for a bank or it's for an individual or whoever. So this is basically our starting point right here. Now, if a bank is involved in the appraisals for a mortgage transaction, most of the time that'll bring in this layer of guidelines and other things that we have to conform to. This is secondary market guidelines, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. So on top of what we already have to do, we have to also conform to this stuff. Now, if it's a FHA loan, then you add another layer of this. Now, this secondary market guidelines don't go away. They basically stay there, and FHA just adds another layer to that. So now we have to conform to all of this. These guidelines outline lots of things that we do, what we have to do, what we can't do, and so forth. And so we're constantly working on that too. And then if you have a VA loan, then the FHA part goes away, and then another handbook comes into play. So anyways, that's really it complicates the situation on the property itself, and that's why there are certain times when you might sell a property, and in addition to that property, you're selling the adjoining lot at a certain price. Well, depending on the type of loan, most of the time it's, just starting here, that can't happen. The lender won't take the loan with those two properties being sold together as a lump sum. They have to be separate.
Two separate parcel numbers.
Exactly. Basically two individual properties. Even though you've packaged them together, they can't be loaned on them together. So, and that's a guideline.
That's under VA and FHA, not conventional, or is conventional the same way?
Well, I don't want to get into really like which one it is and which one it isn't. I'm just saying that's kind of the crux that comes into play that may or may not come into play if it wasn't a mortgage loan. Right. So I guess those are just the little nuances that sometimes realtors don't understand why we can or we can't do that. Or if it's an accessory dwelling unit or a second home on the property, those are triggers in the mortgage lending world that require additional analysis, or that require something that can't be done that otherwise could be done if it was just a regular appraisal.
So oftentimes what will happen is the value will come in and they'll say, but wait, did you not know we have this second unit on the property? And we get rent from that, right? Well, it wasn't being purchased as an investment property. And anyway, and so, no, it's not considered the same because the guidelines may not even allow it, correct?
Yes, and then there's
it might
also,
just be an accessory building. It might be a rentable unit, but you might have to consider it a shed.
well, yes,
shed.
and there might be times when the property has been used as a 2-unit property for who knows how long. But the reality of it is that's not an illegal use within that zoned area. And so, you might sell the house as a duplex or the property as a duplex, but in reality, it legally can't be used that way. Therefore, we can't value it as a duplex because it's all, part of those guidelines. And that's kind of more just the very start anyways, with the base.
I know oftentimes you guys get called out to properties as just a typical appraisal and you get there and it's something different, right?
Exactly.
And acreage is another issue, right? So you guys are not farm appraisers, so there's a limitation to how much land that you can factor into a typical standard residential appraisal.
Correct.
And I don't know what that number is. Is it under 40?
Or when you get to that point, when you get to a 40-acre parcel, that's not just a residential home anymore. That's more of a income-producing farm, or, if it's dry ground and there's nothing but sagebrush, it could probably still be a residential property. But when you get into bigger acreages, you're not buying it just for a residential home anymore anyway.
Right. So when I think of that, I know that this happens also. So you'll be called out to do that, and you say, oh, there's 2 units on the property, and the lender will say, we just want you to appraise it as a residential unit, right? So then maybe the value doesn't come in because someone saw value in something else in the property. They're willing to pay that extra money, but the lender is not willing to appraise.
Not willing.
Or
for us
not willing to
consider-
lend and
Yeah,
consider.
they don't want us to put value on that
Yes.
particular feature, because that's not going to conform to their loan. So therefore, the value has to be what it is without that.
Right.
So speaking of that, and I hope I'm okay to ask a question, but auxiliary structures, pools, shops, you guys have limitations on what you're allowed to give those items?
Well, the limitations, depending on a lot of different factors, the loan program, who the lender is, what they're willing to loan on, can weigh into that. But also we're trying to determine the value of those accessory features.
I just had heard
Not
there
the
was
cost.
caps on those.
I've never heard of caps.
Okay, well,
No,
that's useful. Thank you.
yeah.
All right. Well, thank you. Sorry, we kind of hammered a few of those things a little much. Does anyone else want to make a comment? Are we good? Okay. All right. So that kind of led us into talking about, that was about comparable sales. Of course, we talked about a lot of things because that's the tricky part. There's so many factors involved in homes and each one is different and unique. And somehow their job is to make them all somewhat similar. And the way that they do that, see, we don't do that when we value homes. We don't do the same. We might a little bit, but they do it really in great detail. And that is, they make adjustments for each of the homes. So this is a tricky part too. Sometimes you'll say, oh, here's some comparables and we'll send it to the lender. So when the comparable property has items of greater value than the subject property, they have to reduce the value of the comparable property pertaining to that item. When it is less, they give it value. Does that make sense? So oftentimes you give these great properties that have all these things, and by the time they make the adjustments, it actually brings the appraisal down. Is that accurate?
It is.
Okay. So we can't understand why, because this one sold for this much. Well, if it had a shop and the subject property did not, and it sold for $20,000 more, the adjustment might be, may or may not be more than $20,000. And you see, so that adjusts that price of the comparable property below the subject property.
That's correct. Yeah, and I think another thing to bring up about comparables is that, basically, if you're starting out just trying to find like properties, you're going to look for comparables in a different way than if you're going to start out saying, well, let's see if it's worth 400,000, and then you pull from the sell price versus the actual features of the home. That's two different ways to look for what you consider comparable. But we always start with the features. We don't start with the prices. And then what happens is at the end of the process, we find out what the price is, or we find out what the price per square foot really is. So it's just kind of the reverse of what sometimes people think. And I know that because when I've ever been given comparables to consider, it seems like all they did was find the price they wanted and then gave me those comps versus actually finding houses that were truly comparable and then figuring out what the price was.
Right.
And the other thing is, as far as doing your CMAs or whatever, you want to make sure that I understand that they're not going to be truly comparable, but if you're trying to establish a list price for a house that has a basement, you're going to want to try to find homes that have basements. If they're 2 stories, you want to use homes that are 2 stories. If they're split level, you want to use like looking homes, even though, maybe even if your, client doesn't care whether they buy a 2-story home or a home with a basement. But that's what we have to do. That's part of these guidelines too, is that they actually outline what they consider comparable and what that should look like. So.
You mentioned earlier that sometimes depending on the market, so in a supply and demand situation where there's lacking supply, sometimes those limiting factors on homes may not give that much difference in value, but they might not bear much of a difference or a gap just because of availability. So, we all know that like split entry, split level, tri-level, quad level homes, they typically sell for less just because there's a lot going on there, a lot of stairs. But maybe in a market like this, maybe not so much. But at the same time, if all your comparables show less, even though someone's willing to pay more, we probably do price homes a little higher right now and kind of get away with it, perhaps. But you also have to understand, remember, if there's financing involved, we just have to educate our clients appropriately because there's a lot of price adjustment.
Well, I think it's important to understand that this isn't a normal market that we're in today. And so there's a lot of abnormal things occurring. And because of that, we end up in these kind of, talks. Because I remember we had one in 2010 or whatever when the market was going the other direction and we were trying to figure out what was going on. And so we're kind of in the same boat. And so it's a hard market to work in. You guys are on the forefront, and people are, emotionally involved in making these decisions. And at the same time, they're somewhat desperate. And then we come into the picture and like Wendy said, we're disinterested. We have no emotional incentive or financial incentive. And so we're kind of the voice of reason, I would say, in some ways, which may or may not be what people want to hear. And so it's not so much that we're trying to, ruin anything. It's just that like, we're just reading what we see and saying, well, it looks like this is what it should be, even though you're willing to pay, X amount of dollars more than what it's saying it should be.
Right. And once again, you can do that if you have the catch.
Yeah.
The difference.
Exactly. Your buyer determines what they want to do. The lender's determining what they want to do based on our outcome.
Right. Which makes sense.
Well, and with determining market value, it has to be worthy of belief, but it has to be supported. So even though, it has to be credible, it has to be supported, and then common sense plays a little bit of that. And like Ryan said, we read the data that is supplied by you. You guys are the ones selling the property. And then when we come in to do a market value, we just read the data that has happened. I mean, that we don't give a predetermined value of what's going to happen in 3 months from now. We read what has happened in the past. And our values have to be credible. They have to be supported. And so even though you have an what's the word I'm looking for? A buyer who drives by every day, or they lived in that property as a youth, and it has sentimental value, or they've made
Intrinsic value.
Intrinsic. They've made 5 offers and none of them they can't get, so they are not going to lose out on an offer this time. And so they make these, offers. That's great. And that's wonderful if that works out between the buyer and seller, but we still have to support a value. And we don't get that by what's going to happen tomorrow, because right now our market, like Ryan said, is just, there's no rhyme or reason for some of the prices, the contract prices that are happening. And to determine market value, we just, like Ryan said, we have rules and regulations that we have to adhere to, but we have to support it.
So I have another question. Let's say you have a listing that goes on and in the course of 4 days, you have 20 offers. And a portion of those are above ask, competing offers. I know the answer, but I'm trying to give it to everyone. But would that not dictate that the market supports somewhat of a more inflated price if you have multiple buyers all willing to? I mean, how would you even know that unless there was an offer that had an escalation clause on it to indicate there was multiple offers? And
Well, if all the offers were cash, would it matter?
well, we wouldn't even call you that, but I'm just
Exactly.
But I'm saying even if it's a financed offer, you've got 5 people competing for that property who all agree that they're willing to pay.
It's the fact that you're involving someone else in the transaction when you say financing.
Yeah, the lender, yeah.
Exactly. So do you think the lender has the same incentive as the buyer?
Sure.
No, they don't. The
That
lender
sure-
doesn't.
That sure was not an agreement.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of the I guess that's the Achilles heel of your transaction, is that, we have a tendency to think that because we're worthy of credit, that it's our money that we're going to go buy the house with.
Right.
Because they said I'm approved up to X amount of
Yeah,
dollars.
the bank has to be willing to go for the ride.
Yeah. So what happens is you involve another person in the transaction who has a different view of value,
Mhm.
which we come back into this. So
Right.
I understand where you're coming from, which is true in a cash,
If you're at an auction.
in an auction and it's cash. I mean, that is the price. It literally is. It's what someone's willing to pay for. But when you involve another person that's going to be a part of that transaction, then they have, I guess in some ways, they sound a little bit like the voice of reason, but really they're more of like, well, let's wait a minute here. I'm going to take on the brunt of this transaction. So I have a few things I want this to all comply with. And so that's where the two conflict.
Yeah.
You know, and I understand where you're coming from. Hopefully you guys can understand the fact that, like, no, you're involving somebody else who doesn't have that kind of emotional incentive to purchase a property.
Right. I think a component of that, that's what I talked about, the education portion from our perspective, to educate everybody who's writing offers, right? You might have all these offers. So I had one recently and it was, like I said, multiple offers. There was only one, in my opinion, that could actually perform with what they were offering. So they all had, almost all of them had escalation clauses, or they were high, or they're much higher offers, but all but one was financed. And the finance ones, and I know the comps, I mean, it wasn't gonna appraise, there's no way.
But not convincing your seller that.
Well, and they were actually okay, but actually the one that, so, you know, I had one that with an escalation clause would have gone above the one that we accepted. The one we accepted was cash. With the escalation clause, that's great, that's fine and dandy, but if it doesn't appraise, once again, now we're back here. Now, if that's all I have, if all I have are offers with financing and no cash and no waiver of appraisals, and that's fine. We'll accept the best, you know, perhaps the best net or the best circumstances for my seller. And then I have to, that's part of my conversation that I'm going to talk about later. Then I have to educate my sellers. We may not get this much.
So I was just gonna ask Brian, if multiple offers don't matter, why do appraisers ask us if there are multiple offers?
I'm not saying they don't matter. I'm saying that it's not.
So it does.
Yes, it can. We want to know things about the transaction. We definitely want to know that. We kind of anticipate certain things because of the way the market is. And so, you know, if a house goes on the market and it's under contract within a day, clearly there was probably a few offers on that. And in the market we're in right now, there's always multiple offers. So we do want to know that kind of information. But what I'm trying to get at when I was explaining that to Jordan was that, you know, if you were just doing cash transactions, there's no third party involved in that. There's no checks and balances, so to speak. The person can buy that property for whatever they're willing to pay for it in cash, and there's no one involved. If there's another person involved in that transaction, like a lender, then you bring in different things. So it matters, but only to a certain point. You know, my job isn't to convince the bank to make the loan and so forth. My job is to just basically give them the information so that they can make the lending decision. And so when I write in my report that they had multiple offers, which increased the contract price above the listing price, that's why I have to know that information so I can write that in my report.
So I was going to wait till the end for question and answers, but we weren't following that very well in the room. So I'm going to jump to a couple of questions. No, you're fine. I'm going to jump to a couple of questions from those on Zoom. Ron Stevens asked, what if there are no comps?
There's always comps. They're just not always comparable.
They're just.
There might be not.
No, that's a good point. Sometimes you guys have to be wizards, right? I mean,
That's right.
or you're expected to be.
We're magic. We know how
Yeah.
to do magic.
So Fannie Mae requires at least three comps minimum.
Yeah.
Regardless, sometimes we can't compare apples to apples when there's a lack of inventory, you know.
So you mentioned to me earlier, we were talking Jaysen, and you said that the AMCs or the lenders, they have Paragon, right? They have access
They
to
have
comps.
access, so I mean,
Well, I don't know if they have Paragon, but they have access to comps.
Yeah.
And so when you put the comps in there, do they ever come back and say, why'd you use this one?
yeah, they do, because they can go on and they'll look in the subdivision, say, well, there's 10 cells in the subdivision, why are you going a mile away to choose your comps?
Because that's where the price is higher, right?
Yeah.
Right, but that doesn't work.
But that's what so that's why it's very.
So it's an opinion. So when we talk about values, a lot of it is an opinion of value, appraiser's opinion of value supported by facts and logic, and they get fact checked.
That's correct.
Over and over again.
And also not only by the AMCs or the lenders, but Do you guys fact check each other?
No, I do not. Yeah, we do have peer review.
Yeah, so I don't know if you guys know that, but they have peer review. So what that means is they'll get sent to review an appraisal that one of their fellow appraisers did to see if they feel comfortable with the value that the other appraiser gave. And I don't know that they do that if they're concerned about there being something not right, or if it's just random. I don't know how that works, but.
And you also got FHA does their own review too. So does Fannie Mae.
So does VA.
So does VA. So I mean, we're getting check constantly.
They also have other tools available to them to help determine, is the value that the appraiser said in line with all the other tools we have that are saying this, that, or the other for the value. So yeah, we have multiple eyes that are looking over our shoulders at what we do. So yeah, we have to watch what we're doing. A good example, I mean, it's not just anybody can look over my shoulder, because all they have to do is if the sales I used were sold. It doesn't matter really if they were sold with a realtor or if they were sold for sale by owner on Zillow. All I got to do is go to Zillow or Realtor.com as whoever, the consumer or the lender, and look on their website, and I can see the photos that were posted for that home, and they're there for years afterwards. And so that can be the case in the sense that if I say the home is in better condition than the home I'm appraising, and then the underwriter or a reviewer comes back and says, well, we looked at the photos on Realtor.com and it looks just like the interior of the home you're appraising. So how is it better or worse? So we always have people looking over our shoulders.
Right.
And when the appraisal comes in, we actually have a system that it goes through. I think it's Fannie Mae system, but it actually analyzes that complete appraisal, and it comes back with a report. If it says, well, you gave this comp, so much adjustments, or so then we have to go back to the appraisers and say, hey, can you essentially give us more information on why you did this? Or so there are those that we don't have control over. We have to do it. And so then we have to go back to them and they have to justify why they made, different adjustments or why they used a particular comp. And
I think this is just a good example of what I was talking about, how when you're not doing a cash transaction, you're involving someone else. Here is all the information that's there for them, the other party that's involved in the transaction, to analyze whether or not they want to loan the person the money to buy the house. And so there's even times when we say it's worth this, and then the lender says, but everything else that we have says it's not,
And that's
So,
what
yeah.
Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac thing. So it's not, every lender in Twin Falls
Yeah.
uses Fannie and Freddie. So we should be on that same playing field
Exactly.
that we all have to abide. So it's not necessarily like for SPED or, ICCU, it's the investor. that we're
It's
selling
the
homes
industry
to.
itself. It's the lending industry. It's, it's in
Okay.
nature. So.
Follow-up question. I don't know if I love this question, but it's a good follow-up question. For example, can we use comps from out of town? For example, Boise.
Yes, you can. And in the process of what we're doing, analyzing those cells themselves, then we may find out that they're not suitable, or we may find out that after adjusting for those differences, that the value at the adjusted sale price of that particular comparable from Boise is just right in line with the sales that have already occurred here. Markets are different. Treasure Valley market's different than the Magic Valley market versus the Wood River Valley market. There's a reason for that. And when you analyze the data, you get down to the nuts and bolts of it, you find out why. And when you take that difference out, then they all fall within a similar range. And a good example of that is that a lot in Boise might be $500,000 for a lot in a comparable subdivision down here in Twin Falls where the lot's $90,000. So just taking out those differences will pull that one in Boise down to the level of the one I'm doing in Twin. So it's possible to do that. Does the lending industry like that? No, they do not like that. And they definitely will not accept that if all your sales from Boise are saying the house is worth this, and all your sales in Twin Falls are saying it's worth this, but yet you're telling the bank it's worth what the Boise comps are. They're not gonna buy that
So
store.
which adjustment do you make first? The adjustment in time of closing or the adjustment in radius from the subject property?
You start as close to your subject and you work your way out. So the ones that are closest or the ones that are most similar in the same market are first. They're primary. If you have to go outside, then that's, secondary or even further down the road. And the lending industry sees it that way also.
So it's not common and not extremely helpful sometimes, but it can be done. And I think the key to that is once you pull out the difference in value, which is probably land, then maybe that, I mean, I think the idea behind going somewhere else is people want a better value, right?
Yeah.
Oftentimes, like, well, how come we can't use Sun Valley? Well, are you people looking to buy in Sun Valley? Well, no.
Right. I've
Okay.
had properties that, were good quality homes. And, well, why didn't you go to Sun Valley? I says, well, why didn't you build your house in Sun Valley? Well, it's too expensive to build there and the land is, well, that's why I didn't go to that market because it's a different market than what you've got here.
Right.
That's my reasoning. It's a different market.
Beverly Hills is also nice.
So is the East Coast, but I think it's not, when you say you can or can't you do something,
Yes.
that's not necessarily the case. Yes, we can do a lot of things. As just appraisals, with just this guideline, we can do a lot of things. Can you do it now that we're gonna do a loan on it? Well, maybe or maybe not. And maybe I can still do it, but they may not accept it. They may not like it. I mean, you can do an appraisal and they can throw that appraisal out if they don't like it, and they can order another one. They're loaning the money. So we can do a lot of things. What we find out in the end is that doing those things may or may not be even worth doing it anyways.
Right.
Going to different markets may be pointless.
So an individual can order an appraisal independently without a lender, but it's not likely the lender is going to use that.
They can.
And you have to have a reason.
They can't. Yeah.
A reason to do that. If you got a bunch of cells right in the subdivision, why would you go to a different
Exactly.
town?
Yeah.
It just,
So for a long time, we just, there was some nice large homes in town that there's no way we could get value for. The homeowners were frustrated until they went to the tax assessors and told them their house wasn't worth it, right? Anyway. They want it one way, but not the other. Anyway, but we're in a different situation. We have a lot more homes with some higher values, and we're starting to see that happening. And it's making it a little easier for the bigger homes, because that's always been a problem for a long, long time, I'm sure. All right, I'm going to move on a little bit. Oh, I do have one more question from Shalene. She says, do appraisers have access to the RE21? And why?
The form itself or the contract?
The contract.
Yes, and it's written right here in your little handout.
Yeah, it's guidelines, isn't it, federal guideline, I believe, or?
It's a part of our professional standards is that, yes, we're required to analyze all agreements of sales, options, and listings of the subject, because these all are factors that are involved in producing a credible appraisal.
So I've often heard people say, well, it seems like they just come into the value of what we made the offer. How does that, I mean, are they that good? Are they come into the value, or were we that good in pricing it?
Yeah, you are.
Right, right,
It's always within $500, right?
right.
Right.
So, I mean, what I know about it, maybe someone can speak to this. There's a bracket, right? So you guys bracket a price, and assuming the value of what the home sold for is within the bracket, I guess you could kind of give value within there. But you also have to be careful. If you're really low, there's questions. If you're really high, is there questions from the lender if you're really above asking price? Not really.
Nowadays, not necessarily.
Not now, but at times.
Well, I would say in the past there would be,
Okay.
but the problem is, or not the problem, but the situation is different now because the lending world has so many more tools to use at their disposal to basically review that value. And I think the reality of the reason why the value comes in close to what the list price is because basically if we're all doing our job, then it is going to be close to that. Other than these abnormal markets that we can sometimes be in where people are offering a certain amount of money way over even what your list price was. I mean, most of the time, until today, the list price was always relatively close to what it probably was worth, So there's no reason why it shouldn't be, especially when that's a transaction in and of itself also.
When we're in a market where we're seeing modest increases, let's say 2 to 3% in value per year, it makes it a lot easier for us to figure those values.
I have a question on, let's say, new construction that went under contract 8 months ago.
Yeah.
That appraisal, is that dollar amount put on at the beginning when you appraise it the first time? And then, of course, you have to come back and do your re-inspect to make sure the house is complete? Or is the value adjusted at the end of the appraisal when the house is complete? Because in that 8 months this year, people are walking into 40 or 50 grand in equity, but I haven't heard anybody bragging about that. I mean, we talk about it, but I haven't heard one yet say my appraisal said. So when is that value assigned?
Well, that's all part that falls right back on the lending industry and how they have structured a person's loan. Sometimes they'll do the closing up front and it's just a one-time deal, even though the house isn't completed.
Right.
And so when the appraiser comes back, all he's coming back to do is basically see that what was constructed was exactly what was on the plans.
What was promised.
But yeah, but there's no difference. There's no new appraisal done.
They're not asking for a new value at that point.
Yeah, most of the ones I do, the builder is funding it, so the closing's at the end of the transaction. So.
And in that case, that could be that the appraisal does come in higher than the build cost.
And is that process any different from a purchase to a refinance?
No, we're trying to answer the same question, whether it's a purchase or a refinance. What's the market value of that property?
So that's tricky too. So I just thought of something. So when a new construction is begun, they usually will do an appraisal based on the plans and specs if there's a loan on the property. If they're not carrying the cost, the builder's not carrying the cost, right? So when that happens, you're doing the appraisal up front. Now, inevitably, people will add $50,000 worth of pretty things, not different things, right? Just upgrades. Is that hard to justify that cost sometimes? I notice a lot of builders' contracts will now say that, that the buyer will pay the difference of what it appraises for and what they put in, because they know that they're going to add those additional things. Anyway, is that tricky sometimes? Wendy? Someone?
It's hard to justify, imported Italian marble when the typical buyer will pay for granite. I mean, that's a good upgrade, but can we justify Italian marble? But I paid $80,000 more for that. We get that, but market value is not the highest value or the highest, it is hard to justify some of those costs and those extras. And when the typical buyer, the market value suggests that somebody's not going to pay $80,000 more for cultured marble or whatever. So, I mean, our job is to determine market value. What's the most probable price that a typical buyer will pay? And sometimes those improvements and those extras and those, solid gold door handles.
They just make the buyer happy, right? And that's
Right.
right.
And the argument I get from a buyer or a builder in that discussion and involving the third party is going to be your answer, but never in a home's life is there going to be a more accurate cost to build it than day one that they get the occupancy permit. That builder knows exactly where he's at and that buyer knows exactly where he ended up.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the argument you get is,
Well, it's because there's the misconception that the definition of cost
and value
is the same as value,
Right.
and it's not.
Yeah.
And so, something can cost this much, but the value of it may be different.
So let's use a furnace for example. I mean, you might install like those hybrid systems are really, kind of neat, really costly versus like an 80% efficiency gas furnace, right? There's a difference in cost. But when someone's buying a home, like in a broad market, someone purchasing a home, they want to make sure they buy a home that has a furnace that works. right? That's important to them. And you say, well, it's this hybrid system. They're like, yeah, hybrid, right? I don't know what that means. Does it heat?
Does it
Yeah,
heat or not?
great,
Yeah.
great. I just want it to heat in the winter and cool in the summer.
Does that apply to solar?
Yeah, we might not get into that.
Please don't. That one costs, if you want us to go into that one, that class, that session will cost.
Yeah, that section.
There'll be a fee involved in that.
Yes, exactly. All right, sorry, let's move on a little bit. So, I mean, this is kind of so I want to talk about this in perspective of time, and once again, this is the education component for all of us as realtors. So how long does it take, and I don't know if this is a fair question, I guess the answer is it depends, but when you receive an order for an appraisal, what kind of time frame are we looking at on average to complete the appraisal?
For me, I would say 2 weeks.
Okay.
Well, whatever, maybe 3 weeks, depending on a lot of
Yeah,
things.
right.
There's not one answer for that. It's gonna be
But
different with
every
each appraiser.
preference.
It's kind of lengthy right now.
Right.
Yeah, on average, I mean, that's what I
Okay.
would say, for myself, my office.
So that being said,
Might be longer for you, George.
I'll tell you why it happens sometimes. So let's just say Ryan gets an appraisal and he's like, nope, can't do it, turns it down. Jason turns it down, Wendy turns it down. They come back to Ryan and say, well, I mean, there's other appraisers, but keep in mind, each lender has a pool of appraisers, right? All the appraisers turn it back down, they come back to Ryan. Okay, Ryan, when can you get it done? Well, right now I'm 4 weeks out. Great, we want you to do it. Does that happen?
Yes.
That happens, okay? So when that happens, you or an agent you know may have written the offer for 30 days to close. That's a problem. Because that lender or the appraiser would have had to gone out on day one, finish, and he probably won't even finish the appraisal before the closing date. And then once he finishes it, so he might finish it and then he uploads it, right, to a system. And then what happens?
Reviews.
It gets reviewed. And if they ask for other requirements, what happens? It comes back. And then, they're having you add a lot of requirements these days, right? A lot of attachments. So it's, what I'm saying is we set our sellers up, we set our buyers up sometimes for something that's going to be problematic in the end. And here's what happens. So these are just facts. So if a seller misses a closing date because the buyer wants to extend, what's going to happen to that buyer in the transaction?
They might lose something.
They might lose something, like, right? So an example would be, let's say they agreed upon in the inspection to give a credit at closing. Now the seller is already holding all the cards, but they may have agreed to something based on something realistic that they found in the inspection. And so now they say, well, we want this credit at closing. Great. Now the buyer comes in, hey, we can't close for 3 more weeks. Oh, really? That's fine. We want your earnest money to be non-refundable, due and payable now. And we're going to eliminate that credit that we were giving you at closing. So the education part here is if you represent your buyers, you are costing them money by not educating them properly and giving plenty of time. So the other factor that holds them back from time or holds the appraiser out is every time I talk with a lender, they're like, when do you want me to order the appraisal? And I'm like, now, please. Like, you don't want me to wait for the inspection? So that's become a thing, and I think it's a problem. And I'm just going to speak on my soapbox here. I think if you hold the appraisal hostage for the inspection, that's a problem. And you're not going to make your deadlines. You're not going to make your closings. I think it's wrong. I think we got to get them ordered. They're taking a lot of time to get this thing done. It's $500. It's the cost of doing business, right? People need to just get on board with the fact that this is the process. This is what we have to do if we want to close in a timely fashion. And when sellers are accepting offers, of course they're going to accept offers that close quicker too. Not always. Sometimes they want more time because they want to find another place. But anyway, anyone want to speak to that?
It's a tremendous sign of good faith to the seller as well to have that appraisal done. They know they're invested in the transaction.
Exactly. I think everything we do to hold everybody's feet to the fire. And if you look at our representation agreement, what it says and how we represent them, we're representing them, helping them purchase the property, not get out of the property. That's not part of it. Now, if there's something detrimental, then yes, we have some outs. And the home inspection is one of those. But I think we have to get going. We have to get, and let's say the home inspection, let's say the appraiser hasn't even looked at the property. Sometimes those things can be canceled too. And, but it's hard to get the inspection. Sometimes the inspection between negotiations and everything else that's going on, it takes a couple of weeks. And if you're 2 weeks into a 30-day closing and you haven't ordered the appraisal, I can tell you right now, it's not going to close on time. Anyway, that's my simple math. But
Well, and the banks will usually let us know if they need it quicker.
yeah,
They're good at that.
but it may or may not happen.
But we get a lot of conversation. If you could just hold off because we want to get the inspection or we want to get the repair so we don't have to do the, another final inspection to cost the buyer. But by doing that, I mean, we understand that you don't want your buyers or sellers to have to pay more fees. And our business isn't one that we go out to try to find ways that we can make more money. Because that $150 reinspection fee takes me away from my office that I could complete a whole other appraisal. So that doesn't bring me more money. That, you know what I'm saying?
Time is more valuable.
Time is more valuable than a final inspection fee to me. So by you trying to save your client $150 or $100 reinspection fee, that pushes us out even more because now that I have the order, I have to put it next week, and who knows what will happen between now and, I mean,
I
like
thought
Nate
those
said,
reinspection fees were just when you and Nathan went and got an ice cream and toured the town.
buy something pretty.
It's back in the olden days.
We're making a lot every evening. We'll drive for 3 hours.
We understand you wanting to save your client the fees, but sometimes that pushes us, that much further. And
Look,
in
it
my
cost them
mind,
their house.
it could cost you your house just by pushing us off another week, because who knows the market right now, we're so busy and so that, we're not, I've had lenders say, you're just trying to pick out all these so you can make more money. That is not the case. To do a final inspection takes time. And I don't want to go dig through and try to nitpick, and we have standards that we have to follow. We have, to protect the lender, we have to say, there is peeling paint. It's it was built before 74 and there's lead-based paint. That's a safety issue. And that's what we look for, safety and structural and, things like that. And we're not trying to go back and, make more money. And I was in an office where there was an appraiser, and she got in the crawl space and found magazines, and she called for those to be removed. But that's silly. That's not a safety issue. That's not a structural issue. That's just nitpicking. That's silly to me. We need to look at structural safety, things like that. And those are things that the lender expects us to find for them, because that's you're loaning on that. But for us to try to make more money on an inspection fee, that's silly. That's not.
The question I often get is like someone buying, what if the buyer doesn't care about peeling paint? It doesn't matter.
Right. It's not
Because if they're getting an FHA or VA loan, it doesn't matter.
right.
That's the cost.
And
of
the
doing
borrower
business
isn't
with
our client, it's the
government
lender,
loans.
right?
Yeah.
The lenders who we work for, that's who we're doing the appraisal for. It's not the borrower.
Yes. Awesome. Thank you. So I'm going to try to wrap up a little bit. I do have a question. So when appraisers call you, they will often call to verify information. I think this is a time where we can really give a little bit of time, be courteous, and answer the questions. I'm guessing that our data information on the listings isn't always as complete as it could be, or right. So you guys literally verify every comp that you have for the most part, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So they verify the information on the comp, or and they look at it many different ways. So I know that there was a time where it's tricky on our MLS because there's a section for like a detached livable dwelling, and if you put square footage in there, it adds it to the square footage, which is a little deceptive, right? And then you have to figure that out.
Well, it would, it also, like if you put in the dimensions of that building, I don't know how it works when you fill it out, but sometimes it'll put it as an accessory dwelling unit. even though like it's a shop or something. I don't know how that works, but yeah. The one thing you have to understand is that you guys are doing data entry into a massive machine that is used to develop tools that the lending industry uses to watch what we're doing, but it also is what the world uses to watch markets. I mean, you're doing data entry. And so when you put that information in there incorrectly and it's not corrected, then it messes up the data. It can even mess up your statistics for your area. You're trying to tell people like, no, our market's appreciating it, you know, whatever it is a month. And it's like, well, it may not be because this one office has been entering all of their information incorrectly. And so it skews the data. And so it's very important that that information is as accurate as it can be. And I know, and I'm sure what's funny is that we come along and we're basically reviewing a lot of your guys' stuff you input, because we're looking at it and we're actually verifying it and saying, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. And we're looking at all your sources. And so when you enter in things like square footage of the home and you accidentally put the finished area of the basement in the main living area square footage, we're going to catch that. But yet if you don't change it, then it skews the price per square foot. It skews your number when you're trying to list things. So it's very, very important that that information is entered correctly.
Thank you, thank you. So is there any, I do know this, so if a house is being rented and you put it on the market for sale and it sells to a home buyer, someone who's gonna own and occupy, do you want that rental data in the listing? Is that helpful?
Yes,
Most of the time it's not there.
Most of the time it's not there. That's what I was getting at. So, and I know I have a listing like that right now. I'll try to, when it closes, I'll try to put it in there, but.
Well, agents, I would think would want that too, because if
Yes.
they have a client that says, well, what do you think I can get for rent out of this? Then you can actually use your search criteria in your MLS and you can actually look up that information that's available to you. So it's a tool that's not just a benefit for us, but it's also a benefit for you, for your marketing, you know, for your, you know, own knowledge.
So do you have full access to our Paragon, or is it a limited access? You can see our agent comments and.
Yeah, we can see the agent remarks, and the agent remarks are very valuable to the appraiser. So I would strongly recommend that agents put remarks in there that say things like, well, it was sold to a relative. You know, that's why the price seems a lot lower than most of the other homes, or other information in there that would be valuable to the appraiser. Like, you know, it didn't include the shop, or it did include, you know, a boat, whatever it might be. So.
Just real quick on that note, you guys all know you can come and take the IMLS input and maintenance class for free. We also teach the Paragon Basic and Advanced. Good things to come back, because Paragon and IMLS, they're always changing their fields, the requirements. So it's just a good thing to go back and refresh your skills on it. So it's all free.
So I want to make one last comment, and then we'll see if there's any other questions answered. So when we started the meeting, Ryan talked about my potential frustration. So let me tell you the big reason why I started thinking about it. So, I mean, there's always these little frustrations. So, I mean, I'm a little defensive of appraisers to a certain extent. I mean, but so the other day, me and my wife were having dinner, and I get a knock on the door. I open the door, and I don't know how else to say it. There's a very sketchy man on my doorstep, and he says, "Is Wendy here?" I said, "No, she's not." She was, but no, she's not. "Oh, well, that's her car out in the driveway." I said, "Excuse me?" "Well, yeah, that's her car." And I said, "What can I do for you?" "Well, she's supposed to get an appraisal done, and it's not done." And I said, "Okay, let me get your number." And I went and got a pen, come back, and when he's like, "What?" And I was like, "I don't know." Anyway, I was like, "Let me get your name and number." I start writing it down, and then he gets crappy with me. And I stopped writing it down, and I said, "It's time you leave." And he goes, "Excuse me?" And I said, "No, it's time you leave." And I escorted him off my property. And as I'm escorting him out, he says, "Why don't you come to my car? I've got something in there for you." I mean, I don't know what he was threatening me with. I can imagine. This is not okay. Here's the problem. Okay, and this is where I hope that we do a better job. I hope that lenders don't do this, and I hope that realtors don't do this. We need to stop putting blame on, well, it's the appraiser's fault. They didn't get it done. They're taking their sweet time. They're not, whatever that looks like to you, right? I know that it happens because the clients call and they're like, hey, we talked to our lender and they said that you're just taking your sweet time, that you're the worst appraiser around. Okay, that happens. It is happening. It happens all the time. And then realtors, we tell our clients, I don't think we need to get our clients involved with the appraisal. I think we just need to help calm the situation down, stand on a level playing field and not just, that's not something that needs to happen. I know how hard, I'm going to use my wife, for example. We haven't had a vacation in a long time. I'm not saying we don't go anywhere, but she works. I mean, we went to Hawaii a couple of years back and she would get up at 5 a.m. to work till noon so that we can then spend the rest of the day enjoying Hawaii. We go camping at Redfish every year for a week. And every morning she gets up, she goes into town to get Wi-Fi and works till noon at the Mountain Village Lodge so that she can get appraisals done. I know how hard she's working to get things out and to get things done. Having all those calls and conversations and complaints about things that aren't getting done is not helpful. It's taking time from getting things done. Anyway, it's kind of my rant. And like I said, I'm supporting the notion that we don't need to really disparage what the appraisers are doing. There are things that sometimes we're frustrated with, and things that don't go on well. But as soon as someone knocks on my door at my house because they researched who my wife was on the internet and came to my house asking for her, knowing which car is hers, that's a problem. That's scary. I'm not scared of him, but I don't like this guy coming to my house. And I don't know what he's capable of. I don't know if he still has a vendetta on his hands and he wants to do something in the future. I have no idea, but that's a problem. Anyway, that's all I have to say about that. Thank you guys for everything. Is there any other questions? Is there more questions from the audience? Anyone in here have another question? Terry?
I had read a while back that the system is trying to get rid of appraisers. They want to go more with an automated approach. Have you guys run into that? Is that something you guys are seeing in your
I've heard
industry?
that since I began.
Yeah,
25
20
years ago.
some years ago.
Oh, so it's just a continued conversation that never really goes anywhere. Okay.
Well, it's an evolution. I mean, it's not necessarily they're gonna ever I don't think they'll ever get rid of appraisers, but it's just that there's so many more tools out there now that honestly appraisers should be using too, that should be involved in. And right now, Fannie and Freddie, they're going through and changing the form that the appraiser uses. They're revamping that form again to be more, I guess, up to date. And it might incorporate some of those same tools, some analytical tools. So,
Do you ever see the industry changing so that when basically the appraiser shows up first to, here's the value now, Mr. Agent or Mrs. Agent, you go market at the value so we don't run into appraisal issues down the road? Do you ever see that coming?
No, I think that goes against the whole concept of selling.
Fair market.
Yeah, fair market. I don't think their job is, or what they're not trying to dictate what you sell the house for. What they're trying to do is, and their tools for the lending industry is to analyze their risk in that transaction. And so it's to eliminate as much risk as possible. Where that'll take us, your guess is as good as mine, but I honestly think that it's just going to be more of these analytical tools, the way you have always done appraisals, and then it'll be Mr. Appraiser, can you look at this information, draw your conclusion, and then let us know what you think. So I think it's moving more that direction. We're more analysts than we are going out there and telling you unique fun facts about certain homes or neighborhoods.
I kind of look at it this way. I mean, the data and the automated valuation systems, they're pretty good these days overall. The more data they have, the better they are. But the computer can't smell cat pee.
Well, the other
I
thing,
mean, the computer can't see that it sits right next to the sugar factory. And when we talked about, locations, I know that that's an issue, like if you take a picture of the house and in the background's a sugar factory, a big pile of whatever, sludge. Anyway, the value, the automated values they don't know that.
Or condition or quality.
Exactly. I mean, so they're pretty good. And sometimes, like if I look at Zillow and Realtor.com, sometimes they're right, but they're both different every time. Sometimes one of them's right, sometimes neither one are right. I look just for informational purposes, but anyway.
yeah, and I think those are tools that, are available to you as a realtor that should look at those tools, just like the appraiser should be looking at those tools. Because that's what we're really doing, is all we're doing is basically reflecting what the market's doing. We're not dictating the market. We're just saying, well, from the data that we're looking at, it looks like this is what it's worth.
So is this market outrunning your data?
So, yeah. Yeah, on a daily basis. So yeah, in fact, we were just talking about that. I appraised a house that sold 3 years ago and now it's selling. And this is not off the contract price. This is just off the list price. But from the price that it sold for 3 years ago to the list price, because it's selling way above the list price, it was a 45% appreciation over the 3 years. So it was in 2018 and now it's 2021. And that's unprecedented. I mean, it used to be 3% a year was pretty much an average appreciation. Yeah, and so it just kind of tells you like how abnormal market we're in right now.
And you think about from a lender standpoint too, let's say, Jordan, you were gonna lend somebody $400,000 to buy a house out of your own money. Are you gonna wanna see what that home is worth, number one? But in the back of your mind, are you thinking, okay, how long is this kind of appreciation going to last? Do I really wanna lend $400,000 on a home that might kind of back down to $300,000 a year from now? What kind of risk are you willing to put your own money?
I'd expect dinner first.
But I mean, that's the same from a lender standpoint, is when you've got that kind of appreciation, there's always that, okay, from a risk standpoint, if it goes down $50,000 a year from now, are we still gonna be able to lend that money? And I think that's why some of our restrictions are a little bit tighter in some areas, is we just have to make sure that we're not gonna be sitting on a bunch of homes. So looking at that market value, what, all your customers are willing to pay versus what is the market saying.
Well, that's when Ryan and I are at the title company raising the paddle.
And I can't say, I've had more homes where customers are paying above the appraised value.
With that particular home, it was selling for over 30-some thousand above the list price. So and that's, a good example of what we're dealing with. Does the market move up? Well, clearly in 3 years, that house appreciated 45%, regardless of whether the appraiser ever came in the middle of any of that to say what the house was worth. So markets appreciate regardless of what the appraiser says. Houses continue to sell, even though we say it's worth this, the people still come up with the cash difference and buy the house. It goes through, it's a sale transactions.
So you're
Markets
not allowed
appreciate it.
to forecast a bell curve.
No, we would love to plateau everything out right now, but we just can't seem to get the sales to do that for us.
You're in about as much control as a realtor is, right?
Exactly. Yeah,
I
exactly.
see 2010 being more scary because you're valuing here and things are still by closing less. So
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions? Online?
None online.
Okay. Well, thank you all for being here today. I appreciate the appraisers for taking this time out. They probably need to get back to work and get some things done.
Oh, no.
Thank you all for being here. Appreciate it.
lunch?
Yeah.
I stress snack
Oh, yeah.
all day
That'll be a
long.
snack.
Well, I know refis are still